Hi there, my name is Anna Dacam and I am the Environment Programme Manager at Sustainable Hospitality Alliance. Today I'm going to talk about something which is fairly simple but also extremely complex. I'm going to be talking about time. I see time as one of the most interesting lenses through which we can understand the sustainability crisis, or perhaps I should say sustainability opportunity, that we find ourselves in. Time has the power to make many things possible. We know, for example, that time is a great healer, and nowhere is that truer than when we look at nature. And with time also comes progress. Most of the mainstream sustainability innovations that we live with today, and indeed rely on, would have been completely unfathomable a few hundred years ago. Who would have imagined, for example, that energy from the wind or the sun would become more affordable than fossil fuels? Who could have guessed that in 2023 you could walk into a hotel room digitally configured to cater to your specific needs and preferences as a guest? Nobody but the greatest optimist or the biggest sci-fi writer in the world would have predicted that we would get here. But time is also a threat, and we know that we're racing against the clock now. We're all aware of the science that states that if we're to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to have peaked in our global carbon emissions in just 2 years' time, and to have cut those emissions in half through a just and inclusive transition in just 7 years. And as time passes, those crucial targets become harder and harder to reach. And climate change is just one of a host of growing and interconnected challenges: rising extreme weather, reduced agricultural productivity, a soaring global population, fragmenting political systems, depleting natural resources, and a widening poverty gap. Put simply, there is a lot to do in not that much time. Humanity's impact has become so substantial that some scientists have proposed that we should have our own geological epoch of time named after us, the Anthropocene, where human activity has substantially altered the state of the Earth and its ecosystem over the last 75 years. There's an interesting thought experiment which maps the entire existence of Earth onto 24 hours. If the Earth's lifespan was 24 hours long, the first signs of life would have appeared at around 4 a.m. The dinosaurs wouldn't appear until 10:56 p.m., mammals until 11:39 p.m, and finally humans right in at the last second at 11:59 and 59 seconds. It took 4.6 billion years of evolution for Homo sapiens to exist. But in a 24-hour clock, we've only been around for 1 second. And look at the impact that we have had. The truth with time is that it's all a matter of perspective. And I would argue that by shifting the narrative on how we think about time, it can help us reconfigure how we think about sustainability. Now, there's one element of time which I am fascinated by, and it relates to how we experience it. Because everyone here knows that we have a real challenge ahead of us in the next few decades. A lot of things are going to have to change to safeguard the future of the Earth for both people and the planet. And yet, in the majority of our lives, we don't actually do that much about it, or at least not nearly enough. And this is a really interesting question for me. It's something that I've grappled with for a while now. Why don't we act when we know the consequences of not acting? As humans, we are hardwired to focus on the present and the short-term future. We're preoccupied with questions like, what will I cook for dinner tomorrow? When will my next holiday be? What on earth will I say in this speech to you? These are questions of the short term. And this short-term thinking isn't just a function of the individual. I would argue that the reason we think in the short term is because short-termism is embedded into the systems that we exist in. Take politics, for example. As we all know, to be a politician today, you have to play the game. And the game lasts 4 years max. Because if you can't convince the general public to back you in the next election, you obviously aren't going to get elected. And so policies and the ways that they're presented and curated are done in a way to keep in the public's short-term favour and to kick any substantial long-term challenges down the road. And we see this time and time again in how leaders are responding to sustainability issues. Many avoid committing to invest in the long-term solutions that we know we need because they'll be unpopular in the short term. And instead, they favour immediate wins. Take a look at the news recently and you will see countless cases of this in action. And I would argue that many businesses also follow this pattern. They prioritise short-term wins for their shareholders and their customers, and they let the longer-term challenges wait. Fundamentally, humans are just really bad at confronting the long-term future. And even when we know that the things that we do or perhaps don't do now will directly affect our quality of life down the line. And this is well documented. It relates to an interesting psychological bias called hyperbolic discounting, where I prioritize my immediate rewards and satisfaction over my future rewards. But what about when we replace my future rewards with the future rewards of humanity? Or even, to be more extreme, the future survival of humanity? And this is where time also gets really interesting, because it isn't just your individual survival we're talking about, or mine. It's the survival of our kids and their kids. And as more and more time passes, the risks are likely to get higher, more unpredictable, and probably more severe. In 2050, when we know that the world needs to have reached net zero, I will be 51 years old. And for those doing the maths, that makes me currently 24. I'm a proud Gen Zer. And in 2050, I will hopefully be in the prime of my life. But what world will I be living in? It's easy to understand why young people are so concerned by these issues. And again, I would argue it comes back to time. It's because for us, the sustainability crisis is all that we know. The time that I've been alive has undoubtedly been a time of sustainability reckoning, where humanity is finally coming to terms with the fact that we are causing substantial damage to the world around us. And I'm not just talking about our effects on the planet, on nature and the environment. I'm also talking about the effect on people, because it's often the people who've contributed the least to these issues who are suffering the consequences the most. Put simply, the systems that we live in, and rely on are no longer working, and the cracks are beginning to show. The first IPCC report came out in 1992, and that was 7 years before I was born. Back then, sustainability certainly wasn't mainstream yet, but terms like global warming were slowly working their way onto the agenda. Age 6, I remember my class giving an assembly to the school about the importance of turning the tap off and switching the lights off when we weren't using them. Age 12, my class went on a school trip to the Thames Barrier, where we were told that within our lifetimes there was a very real risk that a lot of London would be underwater. And at university, I spent a few months in a rural farming village in Zambia, where I saw firsthand the impact of an unseasonably dry, wet season. 4 years later, that same village in Zambia has suffered catastrophic flooding from extreme rainfall. Many families who I knew incredibly well have lost everything they own, and those same farms have been completely destroyed again. This is a brilliant and very brutally honest book, which I found in my 4-year-old cousin's bookshelf. And it makes me think, If I can just about remember a time when sustainability wasn't in our collective vocabulary, can you imagine how integral these topics will be for a child being born today? Many of you watching this will have children, and as sustainability becomes more mainstream, I have no doubt that they will be asking themselves many of the same questions that I am asking. Why are we not doing more? Why are we continuing down this path when we know that the longer we leave it, the worse it will be? Why didn't our parents or our grandparents' generation do something? The truth is that young people are desperately looking for leadership. I have a lot of hope for what humanity can achieve, especially when we're under pressure. We saw it during the pandemic, and we see it in every incredible response to an emergency situation, many of which, of course, are climate related. And again, it comes back to time. We're really good at responding to what's immediate. But I'm also hopeful because I think industries are changing to embrace longer term thinking. Look at the fashion industry, for example. For years and years, it's a business model entirely constructed around short-term thinking. Nobody buys from fast fashion brands thinking they're buying a timeless, high-quality piece that will see them through the next decade, and maybe one day they can pass it down to their kids. Nobody thinks like that. Fast fashion has relied on hyperbolic discounting. For years, it's been telling us that we need the newest thing now, with the knowledge that next year there'll be another new thing that we need to replace it with. And this is the clothes dump in the Atacama Desert. 59,000 tons of clothes are dumped in the desert in Chile each year because they can't be sold and they are too polluting to be put in municipal landfill. Too polluting. This is the effect of short-term thinking. But that short-term tide is beginning to turn. Today, the fashion industry is often praised as leading the way in the sustainability movement of big business. The rise of the slow fashion movement and the trend of buying clothes secondhand are a testament to what can be achieved when an industry and its consumers question the short-termist assumptions about how it operates and embrace a long-term approach. And this is the effect of short-term thinking in our industry. Overcrowding, pollution, and community tensions, to name just a few of the issues. It's time for the same dramatic shift in travel and tourism. There is no doubt that in this present moment, there is more demand for sustainable travel than there has ever been before. We know from Booking.com that 80% of travellers now think that sustainable travel is important. And we're already seeing these sentiments translating into action. A recent WTTC report found that 69% of travellers actively seek sustainable travel options. And Gen Z is acting on these beliefs and changing their behaviour more than any other generation has done before them. Half of Gen Zers have reduced how much they buy, and 45% have changed their consumer habits away from certain brands because of sustainability or ethics concerns. What we consume and how we consume it has become a fundamental element of the identities of young people today. To give a personal example, I buy all of my clothes secondhand, I don't eat meat, I cycle everywhere, I don't own a car, and as a typical Gen Zer, I have an unmanageable number of houseplants. Recently, I also took part in the International Litter Picking World Cup, which, believe it or not, is a real sport, and it is as ridiculous as it sounds. And when it comes to travelling, I absolutely love to travel. But I have to admit, I get a little bit of guilt every time I get on a plane. And wherever possible, I will look to take the train instead. So, let's return to my 2050 scenario. When I'm 51, here are some things that I hope I will have from my holiday. First, and perhaps unsurprisingly, sustainable will be the default. In 2050, I won't have to consciously seek out a green or a sustainable package, or to scrutinise a company's credentials or their ESG report, because sustainability will be the norm. It will be entirely embedded across every element of my holiday. What if the circular economy just became the economy? What if ethical recruitment just became recruitment? Hotel companies have so much power to shift the narrative, to make sustainable hospitality the default. And they'll need to, because if a business isn't taking sustainability seriously in 2050, it will have lost out on a growing segment of consumers who are desperately searching for and expecting this reality. Second, I envision a full systems approach to how I will plan and book my holiday. Every element of my trip will be seamlessly integrated together, from my choice of destination, to the transport I take, to the accommodation I stay in, all the way to the local businesses that I support through my experiences in the destination. I imagine that each of these stakeholders will be working collaboratively with one another and openly with one another to create bespoke, regenerative experiences for travellers like me. Not only will I benefit from being there, but so will each of these stakeholders. Because we know that collaboration is essential. And just like with nature, in a tourism ecosystem, if one stakeholder is affected, the whole network suffers. Companies need to have embraced that systems approach to look beyond the conventional barriers and parameters of their business to think about the wider system. And third, I expect full transparency on my impact, both positive and negative, so that I can make informed decisions. I want to compare different destinations, transportation, and accommodation options to ensure that they align with my personal values and preferences. I want to know the exact environmental impact of my trip, the water I've used, the waste I've produced and where it's gone, as well as the social impacts, the number of local businesses I've supported, the proportion of food I've eaten which is locally sourced, the number of disadvantaged youth I've supported into employment through my tourism. In the same way that Gen Z are obsessed with tracking our health and well-being through apps and smartwatches, in 2050, I hope that I can come away from my holiday with a complete picture of the impact that I've had. This is what I envision when I think about net positive hospitality. It's a radical rethink of what it means to travel and what it means to provide hospitality. And maybe I'm completely wrong in my assumptions, but if it's anything like what I've just described, I, for one, cannot wait for my holiday in 2050. So we arrive at the big question. How on earth do we get there? How do we translate sentiments into action? How can we move beyond a short-term system of thinking to embrace a longer-term approach? Well, first, we need to use our platform. I urge everyone watching this to use your voice and the amazing power you have to influence and inspire change. We are so privileged to work in jobs where we have the power to do amazing things, to have a genuine impact on so many people, the planet, and ultimately on the future of how the world works. And for me, that is a real responsibility, and I don't take it lightly. It's easy to find excuses, to hold back, to stay quiet, to wait and to see what others are doing, but we can't afford to wait. Tackling sustainability requires us to be bold, to stand up, and to watch as others follow. Second, we cannot delay. It's easy to focus on the day-to-day crises, to jump back to the short-term thinking. It's what we're hardwired to do. But kicking the can down the road won't work forever, and we know that we need action now. It can be scary to stick your neck out because there's always more that can be done, and there's no perfect way to respond to these huge challenges that we're facing. But the first step is to start on the journey. No action is too small. If it gets people thinking and engaging, it has value. And finally, it is absolutely essential that we include the voices of young people. The change we need requires inclusive and participatory approaches and solutions. Young people don't promise to know everything. We don't have all the answers, but we can give you a perspective that you may not have. And maybe, just maybe, we can convince you to see things in a different way. Ultimately, it comes down to this. We need to shift the temporal lens that we use when we think about sustainability. Because at the end of the day, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. It's not about the legacy compared to those who came before us. It's about what state we leave the world in for those who come after. Ironically, it's only when we embrace a long-term approach that we realise the urgency of acting now. So, the clock is ticking, and there is no time to waste. My question to you is, what will you do with your time? Thank you.